Good morning, everybody. I hope the weather makes you productive or at least you feel a bit easier because it's not that hot. My name is Anna Ivanchenko. I'm a freelance interpreter since 2007. For 10 years, I have been involved in medical interpretation and translation, and the first topic that I studied with was clinical studies, clinical trials. I had a huge document, about 300 pages. I translated it, and I understand that I really hooked on the topic. And since that time, I'm doing medical interpretation, and I hope I'm successful at it. My name is Dmytro Shapochka. It's not that easy to name my job in Ukrainian. Very often people say molecular geneticist or molecular biologist, but these are a bit of umbrella terms because molecular biologist deals with everything about molecular processes inside the cells, not necessarily human cells, but all other cells. Molecular geneticists, these are molecular genetic processes, but everywhere. And it is not only about oncology and, again, not necessarily related to human studies. In the West, I'm called molecular pathologist. In Ukrainian, probably it will sound as molecular pathologist, molecularный patholog, but this term is not established as yet. But these are people who deal with molecular and genetic things related to tumors. For example, some molecular issues related to diagnosis specification or to individualized treatment, etc. And today we are going to tell you about clinical trials, clinical studies. While we were looking through our presentation before our report and while we were trying to divide the sections of the presentations, it occurred to me that probably it's not very clear. Is it about clinical trials or is it about interpretation? In one song, they say it's quite difficult to understand without some vodka. And let's start with the way people think about clinical trials and about what people do in clinical trials. We are inside the clinical studies, clinical trials. We are actually not inside the very trial, but at least we are at the periphery. I would say we support clinical trials. But lots of people think that those who work in clinical studies have to travel a lot and probably think it's like that. Some people think that these are medical meetings, but in real life, it involves lots of paperwork, documents, different types of forms and protocols to be filled in by our investigations or by our clinical research associates. The doctor and the researcher are just the same people. Today, this person is treating patients, and tomorrow or in the evening, the same person is already on site and is already called an investigator or clinical research associate. Treatment within clinical studies or clinical trials cannot be called treatment. It's rather scientific research, and the terminology is different. But we get to the beginning of our report. About terminology, in English it's simple, clinical studies and clinical trials. And in Russian it's клинические исследования, клинические испытания. But it's not that simple. In Russian, as it often happens, two terminology, clinical studies and clinical trials have become full synonyms. However, in English, they are a bit different. Clinical studies are not the same as clinical trials, as clinical trials is more general term and clinical trials is a narrow term. There are two types of clinical studies. The first type is observational and the second type is interventional. Well, how are they different? Observational studies is when the doctor, the researcher, is not interfering into the process of treatment. The patients are just observed and having some sample, he will make some conclusions. If we are talking about interventional clinical trials, this is the very experiment or trial. And therefore, interventional clinical studies may be replaced with the term clinical trials. Definition. This is trial of new non-registered drugs or researching the existing ones, but in a new way. We are talking about new indications, new dosage, new administration, new combination, or new category of patients. I would like to specify a bit. Clinical trials, clinical studies is usually understood as something related to medical treatment or drug-related treatment, but it may be radiotherapy or it may be a surgical treatment in a new way, or for example the treatment may be just the same but the combination of procedures might be different. First of all, drug-related treatment and then surgery or vice versa. Or for example, it may be about research of a screening system. It will be still a clinical trial or clinical study. But today we are going to talk about those clinical studies that happen in Ukraine, and mainly they are drug-related clinical trials. Types of clinical studies, open or open label. This is the trial where all the patients are given the investigational drug, and controlled clinical studies where the investigational drug is compared to a standard of care. There is a control group that is given something that is usually given in clinical practice, but there is an experimental group that is given an investigational drug. Some other types of clinical studies, randomized and non-randomized. Randomized clinical trial is the trial where patients are allocated regarding the groups randomly, who will get investigational drug and who will get standard of care. Non-randomized is the trial where the patients may choose what they will be given, or the associates allocate the patients into the group according to their own purposes. The open trial is actually non-randomized because everybody is given just the same drug. So controlled clinical trial is randomized trial. Now let's talk about blindness of trial. Who knows and who doesn't know something? There is single blind trial where the patient doesn't know what kind of group the patient belongs to. There is double blind trial where the information is not known both to patients and to doctors. There is even triple blind trial where the monitors, where the representatives of the sponsors located on site also do not know what kind of group the patients belong to. And probably the managerial body know this information. And later they deal with unblinding the trial. In the majority of cases, the trials are double-blind when the monitors know what group the patients belonged to, but the very patients and the doctors do not have this information. Why the patients do not know about it? It's for ethical reasons. Why doctors do not have this information? For the doctor to be unbiased, to be objective, because there may be some biases. Okay, he is an experimental group, the results should be better. What is the primary purpose of a clinical trial? To get reliable data, to get credible data of the trial. Some more types of clinical trials. Unicenter and multicenter. Unicenter trial, where there is only one site, one clinic, and multicenter, where there are lots of hospitals and clinics. And as translators and as interpreters, we usually deal with the second one, when the clinical trial is conducted in 10 or even 20 countries. And the terms that may look similar, single arm and multi-arm trials. Single-arm clinical trial when there is only one group, and again it will be non-randomized and it will be open-label trial. Multi-arm trial, this is usually controlled and randomized when there are several groups, not necessarily 2 groups. Actually, there can be even 10 groups. For example, some early phases when the drug is researched regarding different types of cancer, and there will be different groups with different types of cancer. What kind of information do we need about clinical trial if we have to translate it or interpret it? So what do we need to know? First of all, the name of the investigational drug. We should take into account that if these are early phases trial, we shall have probably some abbreviation from figures and letters. The second aspect is the study design, randomized, non-randomized, open, the degree of blindness, etc. The third aspect is inclusion-exclusion criteria. Definitely not all the patients are recruited into the trial. There are different types of criteria which are taken into account in order to get homogeneous group and in order to get credible and objective data. And finally, primary and secondary endpoints. This is the aspect which shows that the trial has achieved a certain outcome. There are cases when the outcome is not achieved. For example, the efficacy was tested and unfortunately it was not the case. And I will add a bit about the endpoints. For example, there are cases when the first endpoint is reached and we do the assessment. So we meet the primary endpoint. If it is met, we continue. Then we reach the second one, the third one. What is the first primary endpoint? This is the frequency of objective response, or response therapy, objective response rate. Objective response rate. What is response? When the tumor is decreasing, when we see that the primary tumor and metastatic tumors have been reduced. This is the objective response. If we meet it, we go to progression-free survival endpoint. If it is met, we go to the final endpoint, overall survival. General survival of the patients. And when we work with clinical trials, very often these are abbreviations. And these terms are usually abbreviated like ORR, PRS, etc. The phases of clinical trials. First of all, there are preclinical trials. There are different preclinical phases. There are hundreds of thousands of substances which are synthesized while we are staying here. There are huge pharmacological plants that deal with synthesizing drugs. For example, in Ukraine there is an enterprise like that called Dmytro. So they synthesize the substances, but they do not know what kind of substances they be. First of all, they test them on cell cultures. Okay, we see, and this type is called in vitro. For example, the substance is effective, and then the same substances are tested on mice. This is the second line regarding efficacy and safety. And if at these preclinical trials the results are good, the clinical trials start. Now the phases are a bit vague, and the way it is described here is actually not the case, because in the past the first phase have really been the point where the test was done on healthy people. Now the majority of clinical studies of the first phase is used on patients. Probably it is non-ethical. We do not know the safety of the drugs, but still it is already tested on the patients. But these are cases when the patients do not have any other treatment options. For example, the patient has already had 5 or 10 therapy lines, but there were no good results, and the physiological condition of the patient is good enough to have some treatment, but all the treatment options have already been exhausted. So this is the first phase. If we confirm that the drug is really safe, we go to the second phase of clinical studies. In our conditions, this is actually phase 1.2. First of all, we test the safety, and then they expand the existing clinical studies and already try and research potential efficacy. When they finally researched the safety of the drug, and when they have already shown that in comparison with historical data, the investigational drug is at least the same, then they go to the third phase, when the investigational drug is compared to the standard of care, and the groups of patients are usually large. So in Ukraine, mainly we have the third phase of clinical studies. But if the study of the second phase, for example, didn't have some standards, and it is understandable that the investigational drug is really the best one, then the drug is approved for this indication. Therefore, I will reiterate myself that the phases are a bit vague because the speed is up.
And now let us proceed to some examples. What should we focus on? How can we decide what terms we should select while we are preparing ourselves for interpretation? So look at the first example, dose escalation study of, I believe you can read this slide. What is the dose escalation study? This means this is a study to test the highest safe and efficient dose. Then we can see the name of the drug, but it's actually the first stage study, therefore we see the acronym only. Then we see the indications. Let me remind remind you such names as solid tumors. These are different types of cancer. So we see the sponsor, we see the name, this acronym as the drug name. The allocation is non-randomized. This means that all recruited patients receive this drug. Recruitment status, this means that the recruitment is complete, nobody else is gonna be recruited. Then next we see that this is phase 1, this is a study drug, this is the open label multi-center and multiple dose drug. During the study they test the safety, the efficacy, the pharmacokinetics and the pharmacodynamics. The drug can be administered intravenously, IV or subcutaneously as seen in previously treated adult patients. So all other patients won't be enrolled because it won't be ethical. We do not know neither safety nor efficacy, potential efficacy of this drug. Therefore, the patients with such diagnosis should have met certain criteria. The second stage example. Again, we see the code of the drug name. This is the study for which the patients with the HER2 expressing recurrent, advanced or metastatic endometrial carcinoma are enrolled. The status is recruitment. This means that the clinical study is active and the patients are being enrolled. This is the non-randomized study. This is an open label, single-arm study. So in this context, these are actually synonyms. The patients with the HER2 protein expressing tumors and recurrent, advanced or metastatic endometrial carcinoma. After the first line of platinum-based chemotherapy, these patients enrolled for this study should have progressed. Besides that, the patients who have had 2 or more lines of the treatment are not eligible for this study. So the eligible patients are not those who have been first diagnosed with this carcinoma. The patients are going to receive the therapy before the disease starts progressing or until the unacceptable toxicity is demonstrated. So here we see the third stage study example. These drugs have names now because they have been registered, they have been approved, and we see several groups of study. We've got 3 drugs. This is the randomized study, and the status is recruitment of patients. This is a phase 3. The patients receive bevacizumab, and bevacizumab is compared to bevacizumab and olaparib as investigation group. Or the second arm will receive the combination of olaparib with bevacizumab. So this is the phase 3 of the study. A big number of patients has been enrolled, and perhaps some of the combinations will prove to be more efficient than the standard care. The patients receive the first-line therapy, and the standard care for the first line is FOLFOX with bevacizumab as a target drug. The patients who have not progressed after 6 courses, after the first line, receive so-called maintenance therapy. FOLFOX is a very potent therapy, but it's not very favorable for the patient's body. The patient, of course, can be left on some less potent therapy. This therapy is supposed to maintain the status of the patient, and in this case, the olaparib is not is a new substance, is a new drug. It's under study for colorectal carcinoma. If it is proved that the combination is more efficient, then olaparib will receive some new indications, so indications which will be added to the previously established indications. So these were examples. We derived them from the descriptions provided by the pharmaceutical companies, and Dima will demonstrate you another example of a study conducted in Ukraine. This is the study at the National Institute of Cancer, and the patients enrolled, the patients eligible, are patients who can undergo the surgery. And if patients can undergo the surgery, it is mandatory that the survival rate is quite high. Prior to the surgery, the patients are supposed to get chemotherapy. Flot and Xelox. Xelox is less toxic therapy. So there are no data of comparison. We do not know clearly whether this more potent and more toxic combination offers higher efficacy. And we have to discuss here the PCR in this respect. This is not the polymerase chain reaction, but this is a pathological complete response. After the patient had undergone surgery and got the chemotherapy, pathologists are not supposed to find any living pathological cell in the tissues of the patient. We may know that some cells might have been scattered in the body of the patient, but most likely that the chemotherapy killed them as well. And if there are some living cells in the tumors, this means that the forecast is less positive. So it is more likely that we did not target all the cells. So the study is aimed at this PCR, pathological complete response. I've spent 11 years in a CSD laboratory, and this laboratory specialized on growing 3D models of cells called organoids, and then these cultures were treated with some substances to see their response. So it is not possible to make individual forecasts for patients without such studies. There are various situations in which we can apply some certain drugs, certain substances. Every clinical study has its own endpoints, such as non-progression survival or this PCR. In our study, we envisage our own endpoints. So we will grow the 3D cultures, then we will treat them with the substance, with this Xelox and float, and then the patient will undergo surgery, and we will compare the data. We will compare the responses provided by the patients, and the goal of this study is to test the predictive value. So we should test to which extent our model can be predictive for selecting this or that therapeutical regimen. And I'll briefly tell you more about the ethical principles of the clinical trials before we proceed to the clinical trials and connection with the interpretation. So Big Pharma is believed to earn lots of money on the poor patients, trying to enroll patients from poor countries such as Ukraine, but in fact that's not true. The patients should sign the informed consent form, and this means that the patient is fully aware of the trial he is going to participate in. So the patient fully knows what awaits him or her. The patients also should be able of a risk-benefit ratio, and this ratio should be favorable. Otherwise, it won't be ethical to enroll the patients. And in fact, the patients in placebo groups are not eating chalk like it's widely believed, and placebo groups are not used for patients with serious stages of oncological diseases. So unfortunately, the patients in our country do not have access to potent drugs, and this treatment is typically very expensive. Therefore, for Ukrainian, it's a good chance to participate in such trials, because thus they can get access to new and potentially efficient drugs. Usually, companies such as big American companies participate in this, or they organize these clinical trials. The FDA should first of all approve this trial, and this organization sets forth very strict requirements. Every country which announces the enrollment to such a study has also its own ethical requirements, and everything should be checked, of course, prior to enrollment of the patients. Of course, there is the reverse side of the coin, and I frequently work with the patients who have exaggerated expectations. The patients believe that if they participate in these clinical trials, their treatment will be 100% efficient. Of course, it is not possible, and we do not know in advance whether this drug under investigation will prove efficient. So a couple of words about placebo. In fact, there are trials which are called placebo-controlled clinical trials. Quite recently, a new target drug was tested, and such drug is usually applied in patients with metastatic forms of cancer accompanied by certain mutations. This drug was applied in non-adjuvant regimen, so this is before the surgery. The patients received the standard care, adjuvant therapy, if indicated, chemotherapy, and afterwards some patients received placebo. According to standard care, they would not be eligible to any other drugs, and then the control group received the drug under investigation, and this group demonstrated really good results. So in case of placebo-controlled trials, the patients are not supposed to receive anything else. So, and now let's discuss the involvement of interpreters. So it's clear that translators have to translate a big deal of documents, but interpreters participate in CRA, Clinical Research Associate meetings. Usually these meetings are online, but in the previous life we went to very beautiful locations, and people could enjoy nice food and discuss all these issues. And usually two languages, two booths were installed for Ukrainian and Russian language. And the second occasion on which interpreters can be involved is clinical trial audits. During these audits, big number of documents can be checked, whether all the patients have signed the informed consent form, whether all the diaries are completed, and so on. So how can we get access to materials to prepare ourselves? Actually, this is a very delicate issue, because usually these materials are confidential and the interpreters are not allowed to look through the protocols. However, many materials can be found in the open sources, such as clinicaltrials.gov. On this website, you can learn at least about the name of the sponsor company, the name of the disease, or you can even search the particular medical facility, medical site. This is the screenshot from this website, and here you see the list of clinical trials which are conducted in Dnipro. And I've selected Dnipro not because we are not far from Dnipro, but because Dnipro is a big center for oncological trials, owing to Professor Bondarenko, who cares about research in this field. If we press on the link, at least you will find brief description of this clinical trial, and usually it is enough for a brief preparation. Okay, so this is the key website we can use, and I also frequently resort to this website. There are not too many clinical trials in Ukraine, like 50 or less than 50. But in oncology, there are 163 clinical trials in the first stage in Ukraine. Well, it's not enough, of course, it's not too many. In Europe, in America, there are many more. And in fact, clinical trials, the statistics is given per capita of population, and the highest density of clinical trials per capita is in Spain. And some time ago, they developed the legal and regulatory framework, and they focused on the clinical trials, because in fact the state gets significant financial benefits. Sponsors give money, patients get innovation drugs, and the medical facilities, healthcare professionals get paid. So everyone, this is like win-win situation, of course. Win-win situation for everyone, but for people who are in the government, let's say. Maybe for this reason in Ukraine we do not see so many trials. The patients, even if the patients have the access to very expensive drugs, it's not very beneficial for the state in general.
I usually help them to choose some clinic and, for example, to go and participate in a clinical trial abroad. For example, one clinic in Spain has the number of clinical trials, which is really high. It actually has the greatest numbers than all over Ukraine. So here you have a number of links. The one on the top is the site with information about clinical trials in Ukraine. Probably you should start with the international link, and if you have found the clinical trial you are interested in, then you may go to the Ukrainian one. You see the European Register of Clinical Trials. Also, you may find this information at the website of pharmaceutical companies. And the pharmaceutical companies have a special page about the clinical trials they do. And you may also go to the websites of the clinic. For example, you go to the website of Verum Clinic in Kyiv, and then you may get all the information about clinical trials conducted there. Participants of clinical trial. Clinical Research Organization, or CRO, this is sponsor. This is a pharmaceutical company conducting clinical trial. For example, Roche, Pfizer, etc. CRA, Clinical Research Associate, this is a specialist coordinating clinical trials on sites. These are not doctors who will directly work with patients. These are associates that will coordinate a number of sites, for example, in one city or all over the country. They are also called monitors. In Russian, we have also the same term, monitor. There is also another term, principal investigator. This is the doctor responsible for clinical trial at the site. So this is the doctor who is directly working with patients. However, clinical research organization may be a sponsor. For example, let's take Pfizer or AstraZeneca. In Ukraine, they have a special group which performs the role of CRO. So they actually deal with all the aspects related to clinical trials. But very often, sponsors do not have these branches in all the countries. In this case, this role is performed by external third-party organizations. For example, Pfizer will be the sponsor, but they do not have CRO, their own CRO in Ukraine, and they hire a company that will deal with monitoring and all this stuff. Definitely, this CRO will be accountable to Pfizer, and they primarily deal with technical issues. Patient. If the patient is lucky enough to find a clinical trial where he is eligible, he or she is eligible, and which is similar to standard of care, or probably that potentially may be better, what is required from the patient? First of all, a clear-cut visits schedule. For example, and very clear template of, for example, different types of tests. Blood test today, then drop, then, for example, MRI or CT. So a very clear-cut visit schedule. And also, the patient is supposed to write a diary where he or she will introduce all the information and all the adverse events. For example, even if the patient falls down and he thinks it is not important, but well, it is important. And at one of the websites, we were just looking through these documents, and it was written there that on the way to visit, the patient fell down, broke his leg, and therefore the visit didn't take place. Well, probably it is related to the investigational drug because the vestibular doesn't work in the proper way, and it will be studied anyway. Thank you. That's everything. Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Dmitry, for a very interesting report. Are there any questions? Good morning. Thank you very much. A very informative and a very interesting report. I would like to ask what source should we use if we translate the information about pharmacological medications? For example, is there any register? What should we take into account? The indication, the substance, how the translators will know that the terminology is really checked and confirmed. Well, so far as the drug is non-registered in Ukraine, it doesn't have official name, official transliteration. Therefore, we are guided by our common sense. So far it is used as a abbreviation, or we transcribe. And in Ukraine, we use, for example, certain orthographical rules related to spelling rules related to Ukrainian language. So if we are talking about the proper name of the disease, there is international disease classification, ICD-10. You can refer to these terminology data. And the Ukrainian side of clinical trials, what about the terminology there? Can it be used as a reference point? Well, probably there won't be that many terms there. Again, if the investigational drug is non-registered, then it will be translated as it was translated. For example, we may not even have the name of the drug. It may be a code. Probably you've seen alaparib, bevacizumab. These are non-commercial names. But olaparib, Lynparza, bevacizumab is Avastin. So if you work in clinical trials, you will still use the term bevacizumab, and you will use the term olaparib and not Lynparza. The problems with names are related to commercial issues because chemical names are really simple. Trastuzumab, pertuzumab, you may not get confused, but, well, commercial names may be really not very good, well-sounding. They will be localized probably for the name to sound nice for the Ukrainian language, but it's not about the translators here. Thank you. Thank you. Are there any other questions? Thank you very much for your very interesting report. Probably I would like even to listen more about it. It's really informative. I wanted to ask about the clients, your clients as you as an interpreter. How do they find you? Well, if we are talking about clinical trials, usually you would not work with direct clients. Pfizer or AstraZeneca are huge organizations. They have their own LSP they work with, and probably this LSP is not even in Ukraine, somewhere it is located somewhere in Europe, and they actually hire us. I have some experience. There is, for example, Korean company Samsung Bioepis. They were my direct client. Well, we didn't continue our cooperation, but usually, once again, these are indirect clients. So probably you'd better submit your CV to LSPs. Yes, to LSPs that state that they work with medical translations. Actually, there are not that many good medical interpreters and translators, and they are on demand usually. And about CV will be told by Anna Aleynik in a couple of minutes, but so far we still can give a couple of questions regarding this report. What are the requirements to the translators or interpreters, for example, to participate in clinical trials? What is required? Experience or probably medical education? I do not remember that there was a requirement about medical education, but at least they would probably ask you your experience, a series of meetings. Probably you should indicate the name of sponsor or probably the name of clinical trials. And the same about clinical trials audit. You are supposed to be experienced in working with clinical trials audit. It's quite a specific area. And in this case, I would recommend two interpreters because they may start early in the morning and finish late in the evening. One will be working directly with the doctor, and the second, for example, interpreter will work with documents and provide some additional information. So this area of work is quite specific, but at the same time interesting. Are there any other questions? Thank you very much for your interesting report. We understand that in order to be a medical interpreter, still there should be some very narrow preparation. So what can you say as a interpreter, as a potential probably client? What could be a format to train such interpreters? For example, definitely we're not talking about 10-year studies, but how can we train our interpreters? Well, this is quite a complicated question. I definitely do not state that you should have medical education, at least 100%, but probably we should start with linguistic training, translation training, and then probably you should specialize. You cannot be a jack of all trades, particularly in medicine. Clinical trials are really positive and favorable area regarding this because the terminology is very specific. But if you specialize in a certain branch of medicine, definitely you should read a lot, you should follow digest, you should follow innovations in the area. So it's self-education. Okay, in our previous report, we actually answered this question, so you may refer to this. Well, the translator should be a person, and the person should be able to think, actually. A person primarily should be interested in the field. If you're interested, but still you do not have some skills and competences, still you won't be successful. So if you are interested, if you try and you have some success, it will enhance your interest and will probably motivate you to further development in this area. Well, I have actually taken a course of medical interpreting and I understood it's not my cup of tea. Jonathan Downey stated last year, перекладач – це людина, яка може стати фальшивим експертом, не справжнім експертом в усьому. Це жарт, звичайно, був. Well, but we are not doctors, but we can do translation, we can do interpretation. Thank you very much. A technical question from me. Tatiana asked about the drugs and how can we find their names. So I wanted to know how should we translate the name of an American drug regarding, so shall we follow the active substance and find its Ukrainian analog, or for example you should still indicate the English name and American name? Are we talking about the active substance or we are talking about the commercial name? For example, there was a commercial name and in brackets the active substance was included. It means you have to translate the active substance into Ukrainian and the commercial name should be given in two variants, the English variant and the one you offer in Ukrainian. One any substance is registered in America, it will probably take a couple of years to register it in Europe. And in Ukraine, it will probably appear some 10 years later. Or probably there won't be official name. So regarding the active substance, everything is simple here. The commercial name, well, you translate it the way you think will be correct, because there is no just unified variant of translation. Usually the report of Anna and Dmitry prefer